It was Christmas night, the table glowing with lights and the scent of roasted turkey in the air. Yet instead of warmth, I was handed something colder than winter itself. A crisp stack of divorce papers slid across the table, right there in front of family and friends, and I caught the smirk my husband shared with his best friend, as if they were waiting for a show. They thought I would tremble, break down, cry, maybe even beg, but what they did not know was that I had been waiting for this very moment, and the smile that formed on my lips was not the one they had wagered on. Thank you for watching, my dear, and before I continue with my story, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please leave me a comment and let me know. Now that night, as those papers lay in front of me, I remember how the room seemed to hold its breath, the laughter and chatter fading into a silence that pressed heavy on my chest. The glow of the Christmas tree sparkled in the corner. Children's laughter had filled the air moments before, yet now every eye was fixed on me, waiting for the tears they had been promised. My husband leaned back in his chair, his best friend's grin stretched wide, and in their faces I saw a cruel satisfaction, as though they had already won. But inside me there was no breaking, no begging, only a quiet strength rising higher with each second. Because I had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful answer is not in the words you say, but in the way you refuse to give them what they expect. I sat there with the papers resting in front of me, and as the silence stretched across the room, my mind drifted back through the years that had carried me to this very moment. When I first met my husband, he was not the man he had become. He was charming in his own way, kind with his words, and he knew how to make a young woman feel as though she was the center of his world. We built a life together, a home filled with the hopes of a family and the promise of forever. I believed in those vows, in the trust we placed in each other, and in the bond that I thought could never be broken. But time has a way of showing the truth, and little by little, his smile grew colder, his eyes wandered, and the warmth that once filled our home began to fade. I remember the first evenings he came home late with excuses that did not sit right in my heart, and the way he brushed off my questions as though they were nothing more than the nagging of a wife. It was around then that his best friend grew closer to us, always at our table, always laughing too loudly, always filling my husband's ear with careless jokes and whispers that seemed to fan the fire of arrogance in him. At first, I thought it was harmless, just two men holding on to the reckless spirit of their youth. But soon it became clear that the friend's influence was a poison, slowly changing the man I had built my life beside. I heard the way they spoke about women, about loyalty, about pride, as if we were nothing more than pieces in a game they played to amuse themselves. I began to see my husband not as a partner, but as someone who had forgotten the meaning of respect. The pain of that realization was heavy, heavier than the betrayal itself, because I had given so much of myself to him, years of love and devotion, and in return, he traded it for mockery. There were nights when I cried quietly, never letting him see my tears because I knew they would only give him and his friend more fuel for their laughter. Still, I carried myself with dignity, because even when you are broken on the inside, you do not have to let the world see you fall apart. I learned to hold my silence, to move through the days with a steady face, and to keep my strength hidden where they could not touch it. So on that Christmas night, as he sat there smirking, waiting for me to shatter, I realized that this was not the beginning of my pain. It was the ending of it. Everything I had endured, every insult tucked behind his smile, every careless word he thought I had ignored, had prepared me for this moment. And while he thought I was about to crumble in front of everyone, I felt the exact opposite. For the first time in years, I felt my heart steady, my back straighten, and my spirit remind me that I was not the weak woman they had painted in their minds. I was far stronger, and the time had come for them to see it. I looked at their faces, my husband leaning back in his chair with that self-satisfied grin, and his best friend with his glass of wine in hand, shaking his head as if he already knew how the evening would end. They thought I was a simple woman, easy to predict, easy to read, the kind who would collapse in tears at the first sign of rejection. But they had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten the strength it takes to hold a family together, the sacrifices that go unseen, and the quiet endurance of a woman who has carried more than they could ever imagine. Their laughter echoed in my mind, not just the chuckle at the table that night, but the words I had overheard before, when they mocked me behind closed doors, calling me predictable, saying all women are the same. That memory burned in me, but instead of fueling anger, it gave me clarity. Because in that moment, I knew that what they saw as weakness had been my shield, and what they thought would be my breaking point would become their undoing. I thought about the countless dinners where I played the silent listener while they made their crude jokes, about the nights when I stayed awake alone, wondering if the man I once trusted even remembered the promises we made, and about the days when his best friend's sneer made me feel as though I were an intruder in my own home. It all led to this very night, this cruel little game they had prepared at Christmas, believing that the humiliation would shatter me once and for all. What they failed to realize is that humiliation can sometimes become the very ground where resilience grows. Every insult had planted in me a seed of strength, every smirk had taught me patience, and every betrayal had shaped the resolve they were now about to witness. So as I looked around the table, seeing the curious eyes of family and the expectant grin on my husband's face, I did not feel fear. I did not feel shame. I only felt a calm certainty. They had already exposed themselves, their arrogance shining brighter than the lights on the tree, and soon everyone else in that room would see them for who they truly were. I reminded myself quietly that I had nothing left to lose, but they had everything to lose, because their reputations, their pride, and their game were all hanging on the reaction they thought I would give. I could feel their eagerness, as though they were sitting on the edge of victory, waiting for my tears to seal their bet. But instead of trembling, I straightened in my seat, folded my hands together, and let the silence stretch longer, because I knew the longer I withheld what they expected, the more uneasy they would become. In that silence, I realized something else, something they would never understand. I did not need to fight them with anger or words, because the greatest blow I could deliver was my refusal to play the part they had written for me. I had lived long enough to know that dignity is not in the noise you make, but in the control you keep. And on that night, I held every piece of control in my hands. My husband thought he had cornered me. His best friend thought he had won his bet. But neither of them saw what was coming, because the woman they underestimated had already decided that this would not end with tears, but with a truth they were not prepared to face. And with every breath I took, I grew more certain that the moment they thought would define my downfall would instead define their ruin. I held my breath for a moment longer, letting the weight of their arrogance hang heavy in the room, and then I lowered my eyes to those papers, as if they were nothing more than a scrap of paper left on the table after dinner. They wanted tears, they wanted trembling hands, and a voice too broken to speak. But instead I let a small smile touch my lips, the kind of smile that comes when you finally see people for who they are. I thought of how long I had been silent, how many times I had swallowed the pain just to keep peace, and I realized that this was the night all of it would come to an end. There was no fear in me, no hesitation, only the quiet strength that comes from knowing you have already endured the worst they can do. And as I looked back up at them, meeting their eyes without flinching, I could see the first flicker of confusion cross their faces, as if they were beginning to understand that the game they thought they had won was about to turn against them. I could feel the air grow heavier as I looked back at them, that flicker of confusion spreading slowly across their faces. And I let it sit there. I let it grow, because I knew the longer they waited for me to crumble, the more they would realize that the woman before them was not the woman they thought they knew. Around me, the lights of the tree twinkled softly, casting their glow across the table, where plates of food sat untouched, yet no one seemed to notice the feast anymore. All eyes were drawn to the moment that was unfolding, a moment they expected to end in shame, but one that was quietly turning into something else. I could hear the clinking of a fork being set down, the soft clearing of a throat, as if those watching were no longer sure whether they were witnessing a celebration or a reckoning. And deep down, I knew it was the latter. My husband sat straighter now, trying to keep that grin fixed on his face, but I saw the stiffness in his jaw, the way his hand tightened around the glass in front of him, because he could feel it too, the shift in control. His best friend, the one who had pushed him into this cruel wager, leaned forward with a smirk that was just beginning to falter, and for a brief second, our eyes met. In his gaze, I saw arrogance, yes, but I also saw the faintest spark of doubt, and that was enough for me to know that I had them exactly where I wanted them. They thought they had chosen the time and place to break me, but what they had really done was gather an audience for their own humiliation. And the thought of that gave me a strength I had not felt in years. I took in the scene slowly, not rushing, because there was power in silence, there was power in refusing to react the way they had planned. I let my hand rest gently on the papers, not trembling, not hurried, simply steady, and in that small act I could feel the room leaning toward me, waiting to see what I would do next. My mind was calm, calmer than it had ever been in the middle of so much chaos, and I realized that this was the gift of betrayal. It strips away the illusions and leaves you with nothing but truth. And the truth was that I was not the weak, predictable woman they believed me to be. I was someone who had endured, someone who had learned to bend without breaking, someone who could take every insult and every betrayal and turn it into the very strength that would outlast them both. The longer I sat there, the more certain I became that this was my moment, not theirs. And that certainty gave me a quiet joy, the kind that cannot be taken away. I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to lash out, all I needed was to remain still, to remain unbroken, and to let their own cruelty echo back to them in front of every person they had hoped would see my downfall. And as I sat in that chair, surrounded by the glow of Christmas lights and the silence of expectant faces, I knew without a doubt that the tears they were waiting for would never come, and that the lesson they were about to learn would be one they would never forget. I let my hand linger on the papers a moment longer, feeling the weight of what they represented, not just an ending, but a declaration of who I had become through years of silence and endurance. I picked up the pen that had been set beside them, slowly, deliberately, and in that pause I could almost hear the anticipation in their breaths, waiting for me to falter, waiting for the tears to come. Instead, I held the pen steady and signed my name with a calmness that shocked even me, each letter flowing across the page as though I had been preparing for this moment all my life. I did not look down when I was finished. I lifted my head and let my eyes meet theirs, and the room grew even quieter. So quiet that the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth seemed louder than all the laughter that had filled it earlier. My husband tried to hold on to his smug expression, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes, the smallest crack in the armor he wore so proudly. His best friend shifted in his seat, his grin not as wide, his confidence faltering as the scene they had scripted for me began to fall apart before their eyes. I had not begged, I had not cried, I had not given them the victory they thought was certain, and in that silence, I could feel the balance of power slipping from their hands into mine. The papers were signed, yes, but the moment belonged to me, because I had done it without breaking, without fear, and in front of everyone they had hoped would watch me crumble. I leaned back gently, resting the pen on the table, and folded my hands in my lap with the same quiet composure I had carried through so many years of heartache. There was no anger in me, no desperate need to defend myself, only a calm satisfaction in knowing that they had underestimated the wrong woman. And as I looked at them both, sitting there with their smugness fading and their silence betraying them, I knew that this was only the beginning of the lesson they were about to learn. A lesson that would wipe away every trace of laughter from their faces. I watched them closely after I set the pen down, and in that stillness, I could feel the weight of their own scheme pressing back on them, as though they were suddenly unsure of what to do with a woman who refused to play her part. My husband cleared his throat, trying to summon the authority he had carried when he slid those papers across the table. But the sound came out thin, almost hollow, and his best friend forced a chuckle that did not reach his eyes. They had promised each other my tears. They had laughed about how predictable I would be. And yet, here I sat, dry-eyed, steady, my name neatly written where they wanted it, but without the collapse they had imagined. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst could have been, because everyone at that table could sense it, the shift that neither of those men had planned for. I saw glances exchanged, quiet murmurs held back, the kind of looks people share when they realize the story unfolding in front of them is not the one they were told to expect. My husband leaned forward, perhaps hoping to provoke me further, to squeeze out the scene he thought would seal his victory. But my calm unsettled him more than anger ever could. His best friend kept his eyes fixed on me, his smirk faltering each time I met his gaze without blinking, as though he was beginning to see that the joke he thought so clever had been nothing but a foolish bet against a strength he had never understood. I sat tall, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because in that moment, I finally felt free from the weight of their games. They thought they had written the ending of my story, but all they had done was hand me the pen, and with it I had chosen a different ending, one that belonged to me. And as they sat there, their confidence unraveling piece by piece, I let the silence linger just long enough for them to understand that the laughter they had shared at my expense would never sound the same again. I let my hands rest gently on the table, calm and steady, and I could see them both growing restless as the silence stretched on, as if they were waiting for something more, some proof that their cruel little wager had left its mark on me. But there was nothing left for me to give them. No outburst, no broken voice, no flood of tears to feed their pride. Instead, I sat there with a quiet dignity that unsettled them more with each passing second. My husband shifted in his chair, his best friend leaned back and forced another laugh, but it sounded sharp, uneasy, like a man trying to cover the fact that he was beginning to lose control of the moment. They had wanted power, but what they were feeling now was the first taste of fear. The fear that comes when you realize the person you mocked has more strength than you ever imagined. I looked around the table, and I could see the eyes of those who had been watching. Family who had expected drama, but were instead witnessing a silence that spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. Their glances told me they saw it too. The unraveling of two men who thought they had won before the game had even started. And as I held my head high, I knew this was only the beginning of their lesson. Signing those papers had not broken me, it had freed me, and the calm they mistook for weakness was the very thing that would strip them of the pride they had built their bet upon. When I finally looked back at them, I did not speak, I did not argue, I simply let my gaze linger until they both dropped theirs, unable to hold it. That was the moment I knew I had already won, not because I had taken revenge yet, but because they had realized their laughter had died in their throats, and nothing they did could bring it back. I reached down slowly, letting the quiet linger a little longer, and when I placed the neatly wrapped box on the table, I saw their eyes widen with confusion. For the first time that night, my husband's smirk faltered completely, and his best friend leaned forward, curiosity and unease flickering across his face. I slid the box toward them with the same steady calm that had unsettled them all evening, and I could feel the tension in the room deepen as every head turned to watch. No one spoke, not a fork touched a plate. The only sound was the faint rustle of the wrapping paper as my husband tore it open with a hand that was no longer so sure of itself. Inside lay the truth I had prepared long before this night. The papers they had not expected, documents that revealed what they had hidden, evidence of their betrayals, and decisions they thought I had never noticed. I had gathered it piece by piece, every receipt, every transfer, every careless mistake they made while believing I was too blind or too weak to see. The color drained from his face as he lifted the pages, and his best friend, who had been so full of laughter before, leaned closer with a look that no longer carried arrogance but fear. Around the table, whispers began to stir, shock spreading like a wave, because it was no longer me under the spotlight, it was them, and every secret that they had tried to bury was now laid bare in front of the very people they had hoped would witness my humiliation. I sat quietly as they fumbled through the box, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my head held high. I did not need to explain what they were seeing. I did not need to raise my voice or point a finger, because the truth spoke louder than anything I could have said. And as their confidence crumbled, as the smugness faded into panic, I felt the weight I had carried for so long lift from my shoulders, replaced by a calm certainty that this was the moment the tables had truly turned. They thought the gift of the night would be my tears, but instead, I had given them something far heavier, a truth wrapped carefully and delivered at the perfect time, a truth that left no room for laughter. Their hands shook as they pulled out each paper, their eyes darting across the lines that told the story they had worked so hard to keep hidden. And the more they read, the more the color drained from their faces. My husband's jaw tightened, his best friend pressed his lips together, and the room, once filled with laughter and holiday cheer, now felt heavy with the weight of their shame. I did not need to say a word, because every page they turned was a mirror held up to their betrayal, showing them what they had become, showing everyone at that table that the bet they had laughed over was nothing compared to the truth I had placed in their hands. I could see the whispers spread around me, relatives leaning closer, eyes widening, gasps escaping as the reality unfolded before them. The same people who had expected to see me broken were now witnessing the unraveling of two men who had mocked love, mocked trust, and mocked me. And instead of the scene they had prepared, it was their downfall on display, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of evidence too clear to deny. My husband tried to speak, his voice catching in his throat, but no words could cover what the papers revealed. His best friend glanced around the table, his smirk long gone, his eyes desperate, as though searching for someone to save him from the truth that was spreading faster than he could contain. I sat still, my hands resting gently together, my head high, my heart calm, because I knew this was not revenge delivered in anger. This was justice, written in silence. They thought they had chosen the time and place for my humiliation, but what they had done was set the perfect stage for their own, and the beauty of it was that they had invited every witness themselves. And as I looked at them, both of them stripped of the laughter they once wore like armor, I knew without a doubt that nothing would ever erase the memory of this night, the night they learned that the woman they underestimated had been holding the final card all along. The silence that followed was louder than any insult they had ever thrown at me, and in that silence I watched their pride unravel piece by piece until there was nothing left but the raw truth they had worked so hard to hide. My husband sat frozen, his eyes locked on the documents as if staring at them long enough might change the words printed on the page, while his best friend shifted uneasily in his chair. The confidence drained from him so completely that he could not even meet my gaze. Around the table the whispers grew stronger, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others staring wide-eyed, all of them realizing that the humiliation they expected from me had turned into a lesson for the men who thought cruelty was a game. I felt no need to gloat, no need to raise my voice, because the scene before me was more powerful than anything I could have planned. They had laughed about how predictable I was. They had bet on my pain. But what they had never counted on was my patience, my silence, and my preparation. Every second of their discomfort was a reminder that dignity has more strength than mockery, and that a woman who chooses silence in the moment of insult is often the one who holds the sharpest weapon when the time is right. I sat tall in my chair, the glow of the Christmas lights reflecting on the faces that had once looked at me with pity, but were now filled with respect, because they saw that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is calm, sometimes it is steady, sometimes it is the refusal to break when breaking is what everyone expects. And as I looked at my husband and his friend, stripped of the pride they once carried so carelessly, I knew this night would live with them longer than any words I could speak. They had chosen Christmas as the stage for my humiliation, but instead it had become the stage for their downfall, and nothing they did could take that moment back. The gift I had given them was not wrapped in paper, it was wrapped in truth, and the truth has a way of wiping away every trace of laughter, from even the proudest faces. I rose slowly from my chair, not in anger, not in haste, but with the calm assurance of someone who had carried a heavy burden for far too long and had finally set it down. The room remained hushed, every eye following me, every whisper silenced, as the men who once thought they held all the power sat stripped of their pride and exposed before those whose respect they had always craved. I did not need to say another word, because the truth had already spoken louder than any speech I could have given, and the quiet strength I carried out of that room was the answer they would remember for the rest of their days. Thank you, my dear, for staying with me until the very end of my story. I am grateful for your time, and I would love for you to join me again. So please remember to subscribe and share your thoughts with me in the comments, because your presence here means more than you know.